Hi, everybody. This is Human Capital, a goal span podcast, and I'm Jeff Hunt. Human Capital is the place where I interview top business thought leaders to uncover the deeply human aspect of work. My guest today is Jeff Gibson, president of consulting at The Table Group. The Table Group helps build healthy organizations through consulting and speaking engagements, utilizing their own suite of products and tools for leaders who want to improve teamwork, clarity, and morale. Jeff has personally consulted with some prominent companies, including Southwest Airlines, Del Monte Foods, Barclaycard, and NetApp. Jeff runs all consulting at The Table Group, which is based on the models found in Patrick Lencioni's books, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. One of his most famous books is The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And I recently finished reading his most current book called The Motive, which I highly recommend, especially for CEOs. Welcome, Jeff. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jeff. I appreciate it. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So I always like to start our guests with a common question. Share with me who or what inspired you to go into business. So rewind your movie way back and think about the people or places or things that really kind of motivated you and inspired you to go into business.
Wow, what a great question. And I think I have a little bit of a strange answer to it. I mean, sure. I think in many ways, my father certainly inspired me from a work ethic standpoint and to strive for something bigger and better and things like that, of course. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you, there's a specific story that shifted my career. I started my career as an electrical engineer. You may not remember that. And I was in designing hardware and microwave receivers and things like that for satellites at the time.
Wow.
And in the middle of that work, I had this feeling, just an unease that this wasn't quite what I was meant to do in the long run. I was good at it. I wasn't great at it. But I always had managers coming to me to ask me about like people related things, like things on our team, if there was tension or things like that. For some reason, they're asking me, a recent graduate out of engineering school, these kind of questions. I just thought that was a little odd. I didn't know what quite to make of it. But then there was this one instance where I worked in a relatively large division in a pretty big company. And the leader of this division, it was about 1,000-person organization, was not a great leader. Even as I look back now, having come across lots of leaders, I know he wasn't a great leader. Mm-hmm. But part of him not being a great leader meant that he was actually getting some help. And I was in a meeting at one point, and there was this strange person sitting next to him in this meeting. And I didn't know who he was. Nobody knew who he was. He didn't really speak. But in the middle of the meeting, he leaned over to this leader and he said something. And the leader's behavior changed like that. And I thought, that's interesting. What's going on? Because then he started behaving the right way, as you
wow.
look. And I saw it happen a couple other times. I'd see him at Christmas parties, standing next to this leader, whispering in his ear, giving him guidance. Well, I came to realize that this guy was an executive coach. And I thought, what is that about? This consulting thing sounds really interesting. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know how to get into it, but I did know that I needed to shift my career. And so I quit my job, went back to business school and learned about all things business that I didn't have.
Sure.
And that was really what set me on this path of understanding kind of the human dynamics and why that was such an important part of leading organizations. And it's brought me to this point. It was a really interesting change in career. And a moment for me, for sure.
Yeah, and I would say there's probably not many people that make the jump from electrical engineering to executive coaching or consulting.
No, and not at all. And actually, what I love it is, I work with a lot of technology companies these days. We're based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and so I'm a techie at heart. So I love to understand their business. I love to talk in technical terms. Now, that was a long time ago. I've been doing this for over 25 years now. And so things have changed quite a bit, but just the fact that I have that connection to some of my clients, I actually think helps quite a bit.
Definitely. And so speaking of that 25-year history, so you started with the Table Group pretty close to its inception within a couple of years. Tell me a little bit about that and your journey there, and maybe share what have you evolved to today, the inner workings of the firm, how you work with clients, kind of a loaded set of questions.
Yeah, it's a big set of questions. You're right. So I joined the company 2 years into its history. So Pat and team founded the Table Group in 1997. And really the idea was, it's like organizations need to be healthy, and we'll talk more about that and what that means. And they wanted to serve multiple organizations because they were just serving one. And at that time, again, being a Bay Area, based company, all of our clients were pre-IPO, venture-backed technology organizations that were growing like crazy. And we worked with all kinds, but they were mostly local at that stage of the game. Pat had not written a single book. Actually, he had written his first book, but it wasn't even published when he had started the company. So it was founded on the company. He founded the Table Group on the same premise that people need to be more fulfilled in their work. And we can do that by helping those organizations they work in be healthier.
Sure.
And so that was the goal from the get-go. But without a book, without any marketing standing, brand recognition, name recognition, just started meeting people, connecting, networking, and spreading this word of, the idea that it doesn't take just being smart to be successful. You also have to be healthy.
Sure.
And so that has been the mission since day one of the Table. 2 years into it, I joined the company I had some consulting background, so came in to build out more of a consulting focused part of our organization, and have over the last 20 years. And get to spend a lot of time with clients. And what I love about the work that I do, especially at the beginning, we were working with clients over the period of a year, 2 years, 3 years, where you go really deep with them. You see the transformation both in the leaders, the CEOs themselves, as well as the team, and how they are collaborating differently and how it's impacting their frontline people. And that was one of the things that really drew me to this kind of work in the first place, was being able to see that transformation happen firsthand. Whereas working in a much larger consulting organization, some of the projects, while important, you didn't get to see how they panned out over multiple years.
Sure.
Well, subsequently, over the last 20 years, Pat is a phenomenal consultant. I mean, that's his heart and soul is consulting and helping people and helping leaders. But he's also a prolific writer and a phenomenal speaker. And since then, he's written 10, 11, 12, I've lost count, right off the top of my head, best-selling books on the various aspects of content that we bring to our clients. Of course, the best-selling one you mentioned earlier, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, is our most well-known book. But the book that really captures the spirit of our consulting work is our book called The Advantage.
Yes.
And that book wasn't even published until 2012. So
Wow.
For 13 years, as I'm with this organization, we're helping organizations be healthy with this framework of what it takes to get it done, which is relatively simple in theory. It's not complicated, but it's hard. It takes a lot of discipline and courage to actually make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of been the story. And over the years, we've developed assessments. We have a team assessment out. We have an adjunct book to the 5 Dysfunctions called The Ideal Team Player. As we were working with teams around teamwork and as a team, leaders would ask us, well, aren't there some people that are more predisposed to being on a team? And the answer is yes, there are. There's certain types of people who are actually ideal team players. And what does it take to become an ideal team player? And then you mentioned Pat's most recent book, The Motive. And then even in the last 4 months, as we've been in kind of the COVID world and dealing with just everything different,
Right.
Pat's created a whole new framework called the 6 Types of Working Genius, which is a way of thinking about the geniuses that are required to innovate in an organization and to be an effective team, and that we all have some, and we all have some that we're not great at, and we need to be able to balance one another. And so it's just been, it's been so neat to see all these different things as we've been bringing them out to be, a consumer opportunity where the 6 Geniuses has an assessment that a consumer can take. But at the same time, we're working with corporations and their senior teams on adopting a framework of organizational health that can transform them, across the whole board.
Yeah.
It's a long-winded answer. I think to hit on the things that you were looking for.
No, it's very powerful. It's exactly what I was looking for. And I think a couple of things that I'm reflecting on from what you said was that your mission from 25 years ago is just as effective today or more needed today than it was 25 years ago.
Yeah. In fact, it not only it is more important because there's a lot more opportunity, as we've grown and we have more influence and we have more contacts, there's a lot of avenues that we can go down. But at the core for us, it's about, helping people be more fulfilled in their work. And that's like, I want to change the world of work so that people go to work and they come home energized because of what they did, not drained because of how they were treated or how their organization was functioning. And if you think about how much time we spend at work, especially now as we're on Zoom quite a bit, or, any kind of video calls, it's like, it's a tragedy if people are just getting their soul sucked dry rather than doing something that's meaningful. And any way that we can touch that and that we can change people's frame of mind as a leader or as an employee, change their perspective and how they actually serve their organizations, we're excited to go after. And our consulting organization, which again, that's where I spend most of my time, it's just a small percentage of it. Whereas, 21 years ago when I started, that was 100% of what we did.
Right.
And so as many companies, we've evolved, but our evolution has been about serving, at the end of the day, our ultimate purpose and having the greatest impact that we can.
Well, the other cool thing about that evolution is, from a consultative standpoint, you're limited in your impact, but the products that you guys are producing can truly impact thousands, if not tens or hundreds of thousands of companies and individuals. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it has been exciting. We even this summer, we launched a new program called Kappa Pro. And Kappa Pro stands for Consultant and Practitioner Alliance. And it's a membership network for consultants, external as well as internal, to be able to learn from us directly. Up until then, we were kind of confined to the 45 consultants that we had around the globe to touch organizations, and lots of people that would read our books and use it on their own. But now we've got this collection of people that are phenomenal consultants in their own right, that are all over the world, that are learning directly from us, tapping into one another. And it's just, it's another way to impact on a grander scale. And we're constantly looking for that.
That's really cool. So let's stay with this 6 types of working genius for just a second. I'll put in a plug because I actually bought the test and I took it, or the assessment.
Yeah.
And
how'd you do?
And so I think everybody passes, right? That's the beauty.
That's right. That's right. There's no right or wrong answer.
Right. You learn what activity either builds you up and makes you come fully alive, or what sucks the life out of you.
Yep.
And I would say it was pretty convicting because it said that I was, my 2 were invention and galvanizing.
Fantastic. Does it feel accurate for you?
It does feel accurate. I guess, I'm curious as to maybe you could share a little bit more about this. And if you want to share, what are your 2 types of working genius? And are healthy organizations filled with a diversity of types? Tell us a little bit more about this model, just so people can get familiar with it.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, there's a lot of resources on our website. We even created a standalone website for it called workinggenius.com. And so you can go there and find out more. But here, the idea was this, and Pat this is just how Pat innovates and how he comes up with ideas. Sometimes they just happen like this. And this was one of them, where one of our staff asked Pat, like, why do you do what you do? And how do you do it? And he's like, I don't know. But this conversation that led to the idea that there's actually 6 different geniuses, and each of us have 2 that we consider our genius. Each of us have 2 that we consider a competency, meaning we can do it if we have to, and we can do it relatively well. But there's also 2 of them that are considered frustrations, things that you're like, okay, if you have to do that for very much time, you're going to be strained. You're probably in the wrong job if that's what you're leveraging. And essentially the geniuses are this. There's a genius of wonder, which is, people that like think about why things are the way that they are and how did something get that way. And they're curious about things and constantly contemplating. I don't have the genius of wonder. It's not, in fact, it's one of my working frustrations, to be honest. I don't like just sitting in a space just thinking about things. But here's the interesting thing. The genius of wonder leads to leveraging people who have the genius of invention, like yourself.
I see.
Oh, I didn't see that idea on my own because I don't have the genius of wonder, but I do have the genius of invention. I actually can solve that problem for you. And I start to invent and create and ideate and things like that. And those 2 kind of live in this ideation phase, which a lot of people think about. They think about the invention is kind of the genius. It's like, no, these are all geniuses, but certainly coming up with an idea. Well, and then people with a genius of invention, they need people with a genius of discernment. And the genius of discernment are people that are like, oh, is that a good idea? Is that time well spent? Is that an effort worth going after? They have good innate judgment about all kinds of things, whether it's a core competency and a skill that they have or not. They just have insight. And people with a genius of invention need people with some discernment to tell them whether or not that's actually a problem worth solving at the end of the day. Otherwise, they might go down this path and create something that nobody needs, wants, or will ever purchase, you know.
Right.
Then the genius of discernment, those people need someone with a genius of galvanizing. And the genius of galvanizing are those people that kind of rally the troops. They're like, oh my gosh, you've told me that's a great idea. I love it. I'm going to help people get behind it. And they're able to motivate people and get us moving in the right direction and marshal resources to get things done. People with a genius of galvanizing, they need people who have a genius of enablement. And genius of enablement those are people who are like, I'm in, I'm on board with helping. I'm going to pour into it. I'm going to be there and help along the way. And then the last genius is the genius of tenacity. And genius of tenacity is like, okay, you've motivated me because you've galvanized it. I've got people who are helping. It's like, I'm going to make sure we get across the finish line. We can get this done. And so, everybody's got two that they're geniuses on. And if on a team you're missing some, it can be very problematic. We have an executive team that we work with that don't have any genius of wonder. And the only genius of invention is actually from the general counsel of that firm, who's not, that's not their job to ideate all the time.
Right.
And so they have to construct opportunities for them to think. It doesn't mean they can't do it, but they need to construct opportunities and space for you to be able to do it. If as a company, you're an invention, say you're a creative company, you're an ad firm, or you're coming up with new products and things like that, you probably have a lot of genius of wonder and invention. Likewise, if you're an insurance company, or you're a production line, you probably have a lot of people with the genius of enablement and tenacity. So, but at an executive level, you want to make sure that you're leveraging all 6 of them in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, you're going to miss something. You might make a bad decision. You might spend time inventing something that doesn't need to be invented. You might execute yourself right off of a cliff that didn't need to be executed because you were going down a different path. And it's just, this is a brand new conversation we're having with clients. And it's so simple as we explain it to people, like, oh my gosh, I got it. And now they change their behavior and how they're talking about their team, how they're talking about their staff, how they're developing their team members themselves, just overnight after thinking about their various 6 types of working genius.
That's great. It sounds like by taking these assessments and having a better understanding of our makeup, and then having rich, substantive conversations, we have the ability not only to improve our self-awareness, but also increase trust internally. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, because inherent in trust on any team that we work with is the idea that we need to be able to be vulnerable with one another. We need to be able to acknowledge our own weaknesses, strengths, etc. Well, part of this is saying, like, yeah, I'm actually not very good at that. I need somebody to help balance me. And so just the process of going through that gives people an opportunity to be vulnerable, that thereby will build trust as you leverage one another over time. Absolutely.
Right. Okay. That's excellent. Let's shift and talk about some of the most common problems that you're seeing in companies today. 2020 has just been such an exceptionally challenging year for businesses, for people, for humanity in general, with pandemic, economic strife, racial injustice, and all kinds of major problems. But as you consult with firms, and as your 45 consultants worldwide and your new Kappa group consult, what are some of the most common challenges that you're seeing?
Well, there's several. And I think, you could talk about some of the easy ones that I think people will rattle off right off the top of their head, which is there is a sense of people just getting burned out.
Yes.
People are spending a lot of time on video calls. You're working from home. You don't have the same opportunity. Even like walking down the hall to go get a cup of coffee isn't the same as walking to your kitchen and getting a cup of coffee. And so I think that's something universal, but I think that's a lot of people have their eyes and attention on that.
Sure.
I think one of the things that's a little bit different that we're seeing is because of that, and because of the immediate nature that we tend to be dealing with things, in many ways, the first 3 months of this it felt like it felt like we were in a 100-yard sprint that ended up lasting for 26 miles. And it's like we were running as hard as we could because we didn't know how long this was going to last, what it was going to look like. And as a result, we got into this rhythm of mostly paying attention to the urgent.
Okay.
And frankly, doing a good job of paying attention to the urgent and important. If you look at
Yes.
Covey's matrix,
Right.
But what we're missing the opportunity right now is finding time where we can step back and just talk about the important.
Okay.
Urgent, important things are actually kind of getting pushed to the sidelines. Teams are not taking the time to be reflective. They're not necessarily, whereas, a lot of our work used to be spending a couple days at outside of the office somewhere. Sure. Where we could, just kind of step back and question your strategy, question your goals, do some things to build the team and to further build trust. You used to be able to spend that time. It's still possible to do in a virtual setting. And some clients are being very creative in how they actually are doing it in person, socially distant, safe, outside, and I'll tell you, every client that has met in person has been grateful for the fact that the team has been willing to come together and stretch themselves and doing it in a safe way, that it was worthwhile. The time has been well spent. I think one of the challenges, so going back to that challenge, is we need to make sure that as teams, we are spending time focused on the important, not just the urgent important, because the urgent important is it's always going to be there. We're always on a rat wheel, just running all the time. But there's some big things that we're going to be missing. And if we don't plan for those things that are a little bit further out, I'm not talking 5 years out, I'm talking 9 months out.
Right.
We're going to miss something. The other challenge that I think we're seeing is it's interesting how much staff, there's changes to staff. There's changes, people are getting hired, people are changing jobs, and bringing those people on board, both to the company culturally and to the team from a team relational standpoint and a cohesion standpoint is much more challenging in a virtual world. And you've got to spend time intentionally doing it. And it takes more time than you really think. And I encourage my clients to have real conversations about their personal challenges and how they're having a hard time right now, and talking about their family. And you've got to spend time doing all those things. But when you have a brand new executive on your team, if you don't take time with them to onboard them to who you are, what your culture is, what they're all about, and help them do that with their team, you're going to find yourself a year down the road having a stranger sitting in your staff meetings because they're just not going to have that same opportunity. And I have seen, we've been very successful in transitioning our work to virtual work. But you still miss something. You miss that in-between time. You miss the evenings where you could sit around a fire and have a glass of wine and just talk about things more socially and in an unhurried way. And I feel like we're hitting the ceiling of cohesion that we can get to in a virtual world. And we're going to have to figure out how to do that. I've been surprised and impressed by how much we can do virtually. Imagine if this were to have happened 25 years ago. Or 10 years ago, frankly, and how we would have had to, deal with it. So we're fortunate that that's the case, but the relational part of the teams, which is so important, I think is suffering more than we might think.
Sure.
We need to focus.
And recognizing that seems so very important. And it's also, I'm just sort of reflecting on the fact that your comment about sharing a glass of wine in the evening with a new executive or colleague that's on the team can build trust and relationship in a way that you can't over Zoom. Right. So what I'm hearing you say is it requires a significantly greater level of intentionality about how we're communicating, how frequently, what specifically. So we are spending time with all leaders talking about things that are strategic, not tactical, because this pandemic has forced us into this myopic sense of short-term urgency, right, where it feels like the path of least resistance is to talk about what are we going to do financially this next quarter, and what's going to happen if we don't make it, versus what you're suggesting, which is much more, let's talk about big picture. Let's talk about our relationships, how we're working together. What is our long-term quote unquote strategy, which may have moved from 3 years to 6 months, but
Exactly.
is that kind of what you were driving at?
Yeah, it's exactly right. And we've even tried to replicate some of the experiences of a traditional offsite virtually, and
Okay.
using, like, one of the best pieces of Zoom is the breakout functionality.
Oh, right.
People have not used, like, if you have a large group of people, it's like, send them into a breakout with just 3 people and have them talk more intimately, bring them back together, have them share. You hear about people doing happy hours all the time, but maybe your happy hour actually needs to have a little bit more structure to it than just showing up and hanging out and just, chit chatting, which isn't bad in its own right, but there's something that needs to be a little bit more scripted. So you're actually talking about those right kind of things. And then individually as leaders, I think we need to be connecting with people more personally and individually. And if you find yourself as a leader getting sucked into the weeds and spending too much time in spaces that you shouldn't be working on, you're not going to have time for that. And what a great opportunity to truly empower your team to do work so that you can focus on the things that are actually going to encourage them to be being more effective in their roles right now.
Most definitely. How do you suggest that organizations take their own temperature? So, like, if I'm an executive leading an organization and, people are, I know that I need to work harder to have intimate relationships with all of my colleagues and my employees. I don't really know how I'm doing. So what do you suggest they do in that area?
I suggest keeping it simple. Let's not overcomplicate it.
Yeah.
I would just ask them.
Sure.
If I have an offsite with a client coming up, I would say, hey, everybody on the team, I want you just at your next staff meeting, just check in with your team. Say, how are you guys doing? What are the big challenges right now? What can we talk about at the executive team that'll help break through some of the barriers of things that you're facing in this time? Let me just hear from you. And then they can bring it back to the team to talk about it. Because we tend to know, we just need to have that venue and space to do it. I mean, I know a lot of organizations do like regular pulse surveys and things like that to provide some anonymity and some regularity of data. And you certainly can use that, but I'll tell you, there's nothing to replace just picking up the phone and calling a few people and saying, what's going on for you right now? And if you need to have an outsider do it to give you the bandwidth so you don't have to do it, that's fine.
Right.
But I wouldn't overthink it. I wouldn't overcomplicate it. I would keep it as simple and straightforward as possible.
We tend to overcomplicate things, don't we? Humanity. It's
do.
very easy to do that. So we need reminders just to, hey, let's just keep it simple.
That's right.
So for sure.
That's right.
All right. Think back on all these client engagements you've had over the years and share what the most difficult question you've ever had to ask a client is.
Oh my gosh. Well, so we work with mostly executive teams, CEOs and their teams. And there's been 2 times in my career where I've had conversations with the CEO where I just felt, I don't think they're really into it. I don't know that they're certainly not leaning in and leading the way that they should be. And I'll look at them and I'll say, do you really want to be a CEO? Do you really like being a CEO? And just getting asked that question as a CEO, because they'll pause and be like, yeah, but they're of those 2 times I've asked, 1 time the CEO was like, no, I don't really get much joy out of this.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And helping them redirect their role to something that they're better suited to.
Sure.
And 1 time the CEO was like, no, he's like, I really do like this, and here's why I like it. And I'm like, okay, good. Then let's help you with the things that are getting in the way. But
that's a great question.
It's not a natural question to ask.
No.
Somebody in that role, but it can be an important one to provoke them a little bit.
Very true. And actually it just fits so perfectly with Pat's book, The Motive.
Exactly.
Yeah. So any of you listeners that are wondering, go pick up that book and read it, because really, and it doesn't only apply to CEOs, it can apply to anyone in any position. Really, what is your motive for being in that position?
That's right. In fact, it's probably better for people to learn and read about before they become a leader of significance.
Very
Because
true.
if those things are not interesting to them, don't develop yourself into something that you're not going to be committed to doing.
Exactly.
But again, like much of our stuff, it's not complicated, but it's a pretty basic question that needs to be asked. Pat will tell you in writing that book, he's like, this would probably be the book I'd want people to read first. He's like, this probably should have been the book that I wrote first, but sometimes the ideas don't come to you in the right kind of order. And so, yeah, I think all leaders should read that one.
Yes, exactly. One more question and we'll jump into some sort of lightning round questions.
Great.
And I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on what leaders can do to help transform their cultures to be more inclusive and diverse workplaces that really embody a high sense of belonging. It's related a little bit to what we were talking about earlier with Zoom fatigue and this migration to remote work. How do we do all these things well? How do we actually create cultures that have these senses of belonging, that maybe even have a diverse set of working geniuses, if you will, but also diversity in terms of viewpoint, a gender, race, etc.
For sure. And here's the great thing. Diversity is fantastic around everything except your core values.
Say more.
We'll be provocative and say your core values should be your limits of diversity in an organization. Meaning there needs to be a nucleus of something that bring the people together in this organization that says this is who we are, because that's where the entire culture is going to build from. And if you don't have clear core values, and when I say core values, I'm thinking like 1, 2, or 3. We're not talking a laundry list of 10, because you want your entire workforce to really lean in to embody these. When you have those, then you can celebrate diversity and encourage it around everything else. But if you don't have those, it's much harder to actually do that, because you don't know kind of who you are and what defines you. And as you're trying to reinforce your culture and expectations and leadership expectations and competencies in a virtual world, having that both so well defined and over communicated in a way that is unambiguous by leaders, people will be like, okay, I'm opting into this culture, and if it's not for me, I probably should opt out. And if people have that level of clarity, everything else is going to be far more problematic and challenging.
That makes so much sense, because it's almost as if you're describing core values as creating the sandbox with which we can all play in. And we can create that diversity in the sandbox. But if we don't have those core values, then all of a sudden creating belonging, creating diversity becomes a check the box event rather than something that's truly inculcated into the culture that we embody. Is that right?
Exactly. I mean, imagine going to work for Nordstrom.
Yes.
The last thing you would want to do to go to work for Nordstrom is, if you don't love customers and love serving others and are willing to go over the top on stuff, you probably shouldn't work at Nordstrom. And you can be diverse around everything else, but if you aren't clear on that, not a great place. Southwest Airlines, you mentioned this is a client of ours that we've worked with. We worked with them on their values. They have 3 really clear core values. They're the fun-loving, warrior spirit, servant's heart company. If you don't love serving people, if you don't love working hard, if you can't laugh at yourself and encourage humor, probably not the right airline for you to go to. And there's plenty of other airlines that might be better suited to you if you're not able to crack a joke about yourself or treat someone well, or go that extra mile. I mean, what other airlines are you seeing people, flight attendants come by and pick up trash throughout the airplane as you're deboarding so that they can turn them around more quickly? It's like that embodies everything about them. And I would want every company, and I certainly would help every client get to a level of clarity around what are those things that we then can build and articulate all of our culture around. And once you have that, then it's just a matter of doing the hard work, of making it every day.
Yeah, and Southwest Airlines is such a great example, because they embody their core values. Like every employee you interact with, you are witnessing their core values.
Right. They are a wildly diverse company beyond that. I mean, you've every kind of person you can imagine works there, which is a beautiful thing. but they all share that one thing in common that they can all stick to, and they can celebrate it about one another.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I'm going to throw some quick questions for listeners. Jeff has not heard these in advance, so this is off the top.
Let's do it.
First one is very easy, at least for most people, and it's also very introspective, which can be helpful. As we finish out this difficult year, what are you most grateful for?
This is actually an easy question for me to answer. I became an empty nester last year as my youngest daughter went away to college. And in the spring of this year, we had an unexpected opportunity for our two children to be home with us for 6 months that we had not expected. And at first I thought I would kind of be frustrated by losing my empty nesterness, if you will.
Right.
But I'll tell you, it was probably some of the most special 6 months that we've ever had, and I'll remember forever and be absolutely grateful for it. Yes. And I'm happy that my kids now are back in their, where they need to be.
Right.
But that's something that I think is, it was a total silver lining through all this.
Yeah, even in the midst of tremendous hardship, there's huge blessings, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Who is one person you would interview if you could, dead or alive?
Oh my gosh. Wow. That's a great question. I think, we're in kind of a political time right now. I would love to interview Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, great. Wow.
I think just like understanding, because there was a lot of tension politically in that time. I think we tend to overlook the fact that there was still a lot of infighting, and I would just love to know what was going on in his mind, how he stood his ground, how he was so so determined and clear about his righteous purpose in life. And I think that would be really inspiring.
Definitely. What is your favorite or your top book recommendation? Now you can do these two ways because Pat's written, like you said, 12 books or whatever.
Yeah.
You could tell us that one. And then what's your non-Pat top book recommendation?
Awesome. So I appreciate the caveat. So my favorite out of all of Pat's books, for those people that have not read any of Pat's, most of his books he writes as a fable. So it's a story. And my favorite is his book called The Truth About Employee Engagement. I love the simplicity of the model of how you engage employees. I love the story. If I were to think on I love reading the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But if I were to think about another book that I would encourage everybody to read is a story called Unbroken. It came out several years ago, and it is an amazing story of kind of just survival and staying strong internally. And it's a true story. It's a nonfiction book that reads like a novel. And if there's one book that I would encourage everyone to read, anytime I come across somebody who's not read that book, I'm like, you have to read Unbroken. It's inspiring, it's real, and it's just a great book to read.
Yes, I've read it and will absolutely validate it's an incredible book. So if you haven't read it, pick it up. Last question. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Probably that vulnerability is a good thing and not a weakness. Mm-hmm. And so many things stem from it. So much of our work is based on vulnerability, but I think very early on working with Pat, he's like, no, vulnerability, we're meant to be vulnerable. And so many things stem from it. And it's not something that we're naturally good at coming out of the womb. But it's something that's freeing for you personally. It's kind of like, was it Mark Twain that said, if you don't ever lie, you don't need to remember what you said, or something along those lines. Vulnerability is just be yourself all the time. Mm-hmm. And if people don't like it, then that's okay. Mm-hmm. But most people will, and that's better.
That's great. That is probably the best piece of advice all of us could have at this point right now too. So yeah, I really appreciate that. So Jeff, it has been great to have you today. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom and your time, and for being with us today.
Hey, it's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
You bet. Thanks for listening to the show this week. We release a new episode of Human Capital on the first and third Tuesday of each month. I would really like to know what you thought of this episode. Send your comments to humancapital@goalspan.com. Human Capital is produced by Goalspan. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please share this podcast with your colleagues, team, or friends. Thanks for being human, kind.